The footage surfaced on a classified server at 0300, grainy and stuttering like something pulled from a dashboard camera in a war nobody wanted to remember. An A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Warthog 72, dropping through smoke over the Kandahar Basin with half its left wing missing. Not damaged. Missing. The titanium bathtub that kept the pilot alive was visible through torn aluminum, and the right engine coughed black exhaust in rhythmic spasms like a dying heartbeat. Tower recordings captured the controller's voice cracking as he cleared emergency vectors, but what made the video go viral inside defense circles wasn't the aircraft. It was what came after. The pilot climbed out 40 minutes later, walked across the tarmac without assistance, and disappeared into a medical tent. No news coverage. No official statement. Just a colonel standing in front of assembled brass 3 days later, his face pale, saying the pilot had been declared KIA mid-flight by overhead drones. The aircraft shouldn't have flown. The pilot shouldn't have survived. And yet, her name was Captain Renata Voss, call sign Revenant, and nobody who knew her was surprised. The nickname came from a training accident 8 years prior when her T-38 Talon suffered catastrophic hydraulic failure over the Nevada desert. She'd nursed it down to a dry lake bed with no ejection seat. She'd pulled the handle twice, and nothing happened, and walked away with a compression fracture and a reputation. The old guard hated her for it. Survival to them looked like luck. And luck was the opposite of skill. They gave her the bottom-tier assignments after that. Forward air control, convoy escort, the kind of missions where you orbited at 15,000 feet and radioed coordinates to people who did the real fighting. She never complained. Not once. But everyone saw the way she traced her fingers along the nose art of the A-10s in the hangar, the way she stood a little too long near the flight line when the sun dropped low and the desert turned the color of rust. The mission brief on that October morning had been routine. Close air support for a Marine reconnaissance element moving through the Arghandab River Valley. 4 aircraft, 2 F-16s for top cover, 2 A-10s for low and slow gun runs. Renata drew the Chalk 2 slot wingman to Major Hayes Carrick, a pilot with 1,100 hours in type and a call sign, Chrome, that referenced both his silver hair and his polished record. The pre-flight brief lasted 9 minutes. Carrick didn't look at her once. He addressed the F-16 pilots by name, joked about the weather, then rattled off altitudes and frequencies like he was reading a grocery list. When he finally glanced her way, it was with the expression of someone checking a box. "Stay tight on my 6, Revenant. Don't get creative." She nodded, didn't smile, didn't argue, just pulled her helmet on and walked toward the flight line, her boots silent on the concrete. The sky over Afghanistan that morning was the kind of blue that made you forget about the war. Cloudless, endless, sharp enough to cut glass. Renata ran her pre-flight with the discipline of someone who'd been doing it so long her hands moved without thought. She checked the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the 7-barrel rotary beast that made the legendary, tracing the ammo feed with gloved fingers. 1,100 rounds of 30mm hate, each one the size of a milk bottle. She inspected the Maverick missiles hanging from the pylons, the Hydra rocket pods, the chaff and flare dispensers. Everything was green, everything was ready. The crew chief, a staff sergeant named Ruiz with tattooed forearms and a crooked grin, gave her a thumbs up from the ladder. "Bring her back pretty, ma'am." Renata allowed herself the smallest smile. "Pretty's not the job, Ruiz," he laughed, but there was something in his eyes, something that looked like worry. She climbed into the cockpit, strapped herself into the titanium bathtub that had saved more pilots than any ejection seat ever made, and began the start sequence. The radios crackled to life as the turbofans spooled up with their distinctive whine, a sound somewhere between a vacuum cleaner and a minor earthquake. "Warthog 7-1 ready for taxi," Carrick's voice, smooth and confident. Renata keyed her mic. "Warthog 7-2 ready for taxi." The tower cleared them in sequence, and they rolled toward the active runway, the A-10s low and ugly and perfect, their noses angled down like hunting dogs catching a scent. The F-16s were already airborne, their contrails stitching white lines across the blue. Renata felt the familiar weight of the stick in her hand, the rudder pedals under her boots, the way the aircraft wanted to fly even before she gave it permission. This was the part she lived for. Not the killing, not the medals. Just this, the moment before flight when the world narrowed to stick and throttle and sky. Carrick's A-10 began its takeoff roll, and Renata counted to 10 before shoving her throttles forward. The acceleration was brutal and slow all at once, the warthog clawing its way into the air like it was personally offended by gravity. Gear up, flaps up. Climbing through 3,000 feet, she tucked into formation 30 meters off Carrick's right wing and held it there, rock steady. The Arghandab River Valley opened below them like a scar across the earth, all brown ridges and dried riverbeds and compounds scattered like dice. The Marines were dug in near a village the intelligence briefs called Objective Sparrow, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by poppy fields and low stone walls. The enemy, Taliban fighters with RPGs and small arms, had them pinned in a dry wadi, and the situation was deteriorating. Warthog 7-1, Dealer 2-6, we've got troops in contact, how copy? The voice on the radio belonged to a Marine forward air controller, his words clipped and fast. Carrick responded immediately. Dealer 2-6, Warthog 7-1, solid copy. We're 3 minutes out. Authenticate Bravo Zulu. The controller confirmed and Carrick banked left, descending toward the valley floor. Renata followed, scanning the ground through her heads-up display. Smoke rose from the village in thin gray columns. She could see muzzle flashes winking from a tree line 200 meters north of the Marine's position. Her hands tightened on the stick. This was what the A-10 was built for. Low, slow, close enough to see the enemy's faces before you erased them. Carrick rolled in first, his dropping like a hawk, and the GAU-8 opened up with a sound that defied description. A roar, a buzz, a mechanical scream that made the air itself vibrate. 30mm rounds chewed through the tree line, throwing up geysers of dirt and shredded foliage. Renata orbited overhead, waiting for her turn, her eyes flicking between the ground and her instruments. Good hits, 7-1, the Marine controller called. Shift fire east, we've got movement in the compound. Carrick pulled off, trailing smoke from his gun, and Renata nosed down into her run. She pickled off a pair of Hydra rockets, watched them streak toward the compound in trails of white fire, then pulled up hard as the explosions bloomed orange and black. The warthog shuddered, and for a moment everything was perfect. Clean, controlled. Then the radio exploded. Brake right, 7-2, brake right. Renata didn't think. She slammed the stick right and kicked the rudder, and the world tilted sideways. A surface-to-air missile screamed past her canopy so close she could see the Cyrillic markings on its fuselage. SA-7, man-portable, shouldn't have been here. The missile's exhaust trail painted a white line across her vision, and Renata's brain shifted into a mode she didn't have a name for, a place where time stretched and everything became sharp and cold and mathematical. She popped chaff and flares, climbed hard, and checked her 6. The missile corkscrewed into the hillside and detonated in a fireball. Her heart was a hammer. 7-2 status, Carrick's voice urgent now. 7-2's clean, missiles down. She leveled off at 8,000 feet and scanned the valley for the launch site. There, a flash of movement near a dried riverbed, figures scattering. She keyed the mic. 7172, I've got eyes on the launch team. Request permission to engage. Silence. Then -72. RTB for rearm and assessment. We're not configured for MA and PADS. Renata's jaw tightened. The launch team was getting away. They'd fire again at her or someone else. But orders were orders. 7-2, solid copy, RTB. She climbed toward the hard deck and turned southwest, the valley shrinking behind her. The adrenaline was fatting now, leaving her hands shaky on the stick. She glanced at her instruments. Everything green. Everything normal. She didn't know it yet, but normal was already gone. The flight back to base should have been uneventful. Renata held formation off Carrick's wing, the two A-10s cruising at 12,000 feet through air so clear it felt like flying through glass. The F-16s had already landed, their fuel reserves tighter than the Warthogs. Below, the desert scrolled past in shades of tan and ochre, dotted with the dark smudges of villages and the silver threads of irrigation ditches. Renata's breathing had steadied. Her pulse had dropped. She ran through the engagement in her head, cataloging details for the debrief. Missile launch point, ordnance expended, time on station, clean mission, no casualties, the kind that wouldn't even make the morning briefing. Then the left engine exploded. There was no warning, no alarm, just a sound like a sledgehammer hitting sheet metal, and the Warthog lurched hard left. Renata's helmet slammed against the canopy frame. Alarm screamed. The left engine's temperature gauge redlined instantly, and thick black smoke poured from the nacelle, streaming behind her like a funeral shroud. 7172 is hit. Left engine failure. Her voice was steady, but her hands were already moving, throttle back on the left, fuel cut off, fire suppression. The engine coughed, shuddered, and went silent. The aircraft yawed violently. Again 7-2, Carrick's voice was sharp. Left engine's gone, I've got fire indication, shutting it down. She fought the rudder, compensating for the asymmetric thrust, and checked her altitude. 11,000 feet, she had room, she could make it back on one engine, the A-10 was designed for this. But then the right engine started losing power. The gauges told the story in milliseconds, turbine temperature spiking, RPM dropping, oil pressure falling off a cliff. Renata's stomach turned to ice. 7-1, I'm losing the right engine. Repeat, losing the right engine. This time Carrick didn't hesitate. 7-2, eject now. Renata pulled the ejection handle, nothing happened. She pulled it again, harder, and felt the mechanism give, but the canopy didn't blow. The seat didn't fire. The pyrotechnics that should have sent her rocketing free into the sky failed in silence. She was still in the cockpit, still dropping. The right engine coughed once, twice, and died. Both engines gone. No thrust. The Warthog became a glider, and not a good one. 7-1, ejection system is non-functional. I repeat, I cannot eject. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For 3 seconds the radio was silent. Then Carrick's voice came back, and it was different now, tight, controlled, but edged with something Renata had never heard from him before. Fear. 7-2, say your altitude and position. She forced herself to focus. Passing through 9,000 feet, I'm 15 miles southeast of base. Her voice didn't shake. She wouldn't let it. Warthog 7-2, Kandahar Tower, we copy your situation. Emergency crews are on standby. Can you make the field? The controller's voice was professional, but Renata could hear the doubt underneath. She did the math in her head. 15 miles, 9,000 feet. Glide ratio of roughly 6-1 in the A-10 without engines. She'd come up short by at least 2 miles, maybe 3. Negative, tower, I'm not going to make the runway. The words tasted like ash. Carrick broke in again. Revenant, find a road, find a field, anything flat. You can do this. She wanted to believe him. The desert below was a patchwork of impossible terrain. Jagged ridges, dried wadis, scattered boulders the size of trucks. No roads, no fields, nothing flat except the places that would kill her on impact. She adjusted her glide, aiming for a stretch of hardpan that looked almost smooth from altitude. The stick felt heavy now, the aircraft fighting her without hydraulic pressure. She was flying on cables and willpower. The altimeter unwound, 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000. The ground rose to meet her in terrible detail. She could see the rocks now, the ruts, the places where the hardpan cracked into spiderwebs of fissures. This was going to hurt. Revenant, talk to me. What's your status? Carrick's voice again, desperate now. Renata keyed the mic one last time. I'm setting it down in 30 seconds. If this works, drinks are on you. She tried to smile, but her face wouldn't cooperate. 5,000 feet, 4,000. She lowered the landing gear manually, cranking the handle until her arm ached and felt the gear lock into place. The Warthog's nose wanted to drop. She pulled back on the stick, bleeding off speed, and watched the hardpan rush up to fill her windscreen. 3,000 feet, 2,000. She could see every rock now, every shadow. The titanium bathtub around her cockpit would protect her from small arms fire, but it wasn't designed for this. 1,000 feet, 500. The impact was apocalyptic. The landing gear hit first, held for half a second, then collapsed in a shriek of tearing metal. The Warthog's belly slammed into the hardpan at 140 knots, and Renata's world became violence. The cockpit bucked and twisted. Her helmet cracked against the instrument panel. Blood filled her mouth. The aircraft skidded forward in a storm of dust and debris, carving a trench through the desert, and Renata held the stick with both hands, fighting to keep the nose straight. If she rolled, she was dead. The left wing dug into the ground and tore away in a shower of sparks. The fuselage spun 90 degrees, and for a moment Renata was weightless, suspended between earth and sky. Then the warthog stopped. Silence. She was alive. Her hands were still on the stick. The canopy was cracked but intact. She could taste blood and jet fuel. Her ribs screamed when she breathed, but she was alive. The radio crackled. 7-2, do you copy? She tried to speak, but her voice was a rasp. She coughed, tasted copper, and tried again. 7-2's, down, I'm down. The relief in Carrick's voice was almost painful to hear. Stay put, Revenant, we're coming for you. Renata unbuckled with shaking hands and tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She slumped back into the seat and stared through the shattered canopy at the sky. It was still blue, still perfect. The smell of burning insulation and hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit, and she knew she needed to get out before something caught fire. She pulled herself up using the canopy frame, every movement agony, and hauled herself over the side. She dropped to the ground and collapsed onto her hands and knees, gasping. The warthog lay behind her like a gutted animal, its fuselage torn open, both engines silent and smoking. She'd flown that wreck for 15 miles. She'd landed it without engines, without ejection seats, without hydraulics. And she'd walked away. The overhead drones had marked her as KIA mid-flight. The data said she was dead, but Renata Vos had never cared much for data. She rolled onto her back and stared at the sky, and for the first time in 8 years she let herself cry. Not from fear, not from pain, from something else entirely, something that felt almost like grace. The rescue helicopter found her 20 minutes later, still lying in the dirt, still breathing, still impossibly alive. The debrief happened in a windowless room at Kandahar Airfield, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look half dead. Renata sat at a gray metal table with a glass of water she hadn't touched and a medical officer hovering nearby in case she collapsed. Her ribs were taped. Her left eye was swollen shut. But she was upright and she was coherent, and that was enough. Across from her sat Colonel Marcus Hale, a man with iron-gray hair and a chest full of medals that meant he'd survived long enough to send other people into danger. To his left was Major Carrick, still in his flight suit, his face pale and drawn. To his right was a captain from aircraft maintenance, a woman named Ortiz with grease under her fingernails and murder in her eyes. "Walk me through it," Hale said. His voice was flat, neutral, the tone of a man who'd already decided what he thought and was waiting for the evidence to catch up. Renata took a breath shallow because deep ones still hurt and began. She described the mission, the missile, the engine failures, the ejection system malfunction, the forced landing. She kept her voice steady, clinical, and didn't mention the part where she thought she was going to die. Hale listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Captain Voss, do you understand how statistically improbable your survival was?" Renata met his eyes. "Yes, sir. The drones marked you KIA. The sensor data showed your aircraft breaking apart midair. We had search and rescue prep for a body recovery, not an extraction." He paused. "And yet here you are." There was something in his tone, not quite accusation, but not quite admiration either. Something in between, skepticism maybe, or disbelief. Renata didn't blink. "Here I am, sir." Captain Ortiz leaned forward, her jaw tight. "Colonel, with respect, we need to talk about the maintenance logs. I've been going through 7-2's service records, and there are some inconsistencies." Hale's eyes flicked to her. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Ortiz pulled a tablet from her bag and scrolled through screens of data. The left engine showed signs of microfractures in the turbine blades. Nothing catastrophic, but enough that it should have been flagged during the last phase inspection. It wasn't. The ejection system's pyrotechnic initiators were installed 16 months ago, which puts them just outside the recommended service life. Again, no one flagged it. She looked up, her expression grim. Someone cut corners, maybe several someones. The room went very quiet. Hale's face didn't change, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped the edge of the table. Carrick spoke for the first time since the debrief began. Are you saying this was preventable? Ortiz's gaze was unflinching. I'm saying Captain Voss should never have been in that cockpit with an aircraft in that condition. Renata felt something cold settle in her chest. Not anger, not fear, something else. Recognition, maybe. She'd been flying broken aircraft for years, everyone had. Budget cuts, deployment cycles, maintenance crews stretched too thin. You flew what you were given and hoped the bolts held. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. Hale cleared his throat. Captain Ortiz, I want a full investigation. Every maintenance log, every inspection report, every signature on every form. If someone signed off on faulty equipment, I want to know who. Ortiz nodded. Already started, sir. Hale turned back to Renata. Captain Voss, you're grounded pending the outcome of this investigation. Medical leave effective immediately. No flights, no briefings, no contact with the maintenance crews. Understood. Renata's jaw tightened. Sir, with respect, I'm fit for duty. You have 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a black eye the size of a fist. You're not fit for anything except a hospital bed. His voice softened just slightly. Take the win, Captain. You're alive. Don't push it. Renata wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that sitting still felt like dying, that flying was the only thing she knew how to do, but she could see in his eyes that the decision wasn't up for debate. She nodded once. Yes, sir. Hale stood and the others followed. We'll reconvene in 72 hours. Dismissed. Renata pushed herself to her feet, moving slowly, and walked out of the room without looking back. The corridor outside was empty. The walls painted the same institutional beige as every military building she'd ever been in. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes just for a moment and let the exhaustion wash over her. She'd survived. But survival, she was learning, came with its own kind of weight. Footsteps echoed behind her and she opened her eyes to find Carrick standing a few feet away. He looked like he hadn't slept. Revenant, he said quietly. I owe you an apology. She frowned. For what? For not seeing you. His voice was rough. For treating you like ballast. You saved that aircraft, you saved yourself, and I didn't think you could. Renata held his gaze. I know. He flinched and she almost felt sorry for him, almost. You'll write it up differently in your report, she said. You'll say I got lucky, and maybe you're right. But next time you're up there and something goes wrong, remember this. Luck is what people call skill when they don't want to admit they were wrong. She pushed off the wall and walked away, her boots echoing in the empty hallway, and didn't look back. The investigation took 3 weeks. Renata spent them in a liminal space between recovery and oblivion, her days measured out in physical therapy sessions and sleepless nights. The base felt different now, smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. She avoided the flight line, avoided the other pilots, avoided the ready room where her name still appeared on the duty roster in dry erase marker, a ghost of the person she used to be. The official findings came down on a Thursday. Captain Ortiz delivered them in person, sitting across from Renata in the medical wing's dayroom with a folder thick enough to double as a weapon. You're not going to like this, Ortiz said. Renata took the folder and opened it. Inside were pages of technical diagrams, maintenance logs, and highlighted signatures. She read in silence, her jaw tightening with every line. The left engine's turbine blades had been flagged for replacement 4 months earlier. The work order was signed off as complete, but no replacement had actually been installed. The ejection system's pyrotechnic initiators were 3 months past their service life. Again, flagged. Again, ignored. Both discrepancies traced back to the same maintenance officer, a captain named Darnell who'd been overwhelmed, understaffed, and desperate to keep aircraft mission ready. He hadn't sabotaged anything. He'd just been tired. Too tired to double-check. Too tired to push back when someone above him demanded more sorties with fewer resources. He'd signed the forms because that's what you did when the machine demanded it. They're recommending a court-martial, Ortiz said quietly. Renata looked up. For Darnell? For negligence, falsifying maintenance records, they're making an example of him. Renata's hands tightened on the folder. He didn't falsify anything, he just missed it. That's not how they see it. Ortiz's voice was bitter. They need someone to blame, and he's the easiest target. Never mind the budget cuts. Never mind the ops tempo. Never mind the fact that we've been running on fumes and duct tape for 2 years. She paused. You could testify. Your account would carry weight. Renata closed the folder. What do you want me to say? The truth, that this wasn't one man's failure, that it was systemic. Ortiz leaned forward. They're going to bury him, Revenant, unless someone stands up. Renata thought about Darnell, a man she'd never met whose exhaustion had almost killed her. She thought about the system that had ground him down until he was signing forms without reading them. She thought about all the pilots who'd flown broken aircraft and never made it home. I'll testify, she said. Ortiz nodded slowly. Good, because they're coming for you next. Renata frowned. What? You survived something you shouldn't have. That makes people uncomfortable. They're going to want to know how, and they're not going to like the answer. The hearings began in early November. They were held in a conference room at Bagram Airfield, a space that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Darnell sat at the defendant's table, his uniform crisp but his eyes hollow. Renata sat in the witness gallery, flanked by Carrick and Ortiz, and watched the prosecution build their case brick by brick. They painted Darnell as negligent, careless, a man who'd put pilots' lives at risk for the sake of convenience. They showed the unsigned work orders, the expired parts, the corner cutting that had nearly killed Renata. They didn't mention the budget cuts, didn't mention the ops tempo, didn't mention the fact that Darnell had been doing the work of 3 people for 18 months straight. When it was Renata's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with her ribs still taped and her left eye still faintly purple. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, and then she did. She told them about the mission, about the engines, about the ejection system, and then she told them about every other aircraft she'd flown that had been held together with hope and wire. She told them about the pilots who died not because they made mistakes, but because the machines they trusted had failed them. She told them about the system that demanded perfection and provided nothing. The room was silent when she finished. The lead prosecutor, a colonel with a face like weathered stone, stared at her for a long moment. Captain Voss, he said slowly, are you suggesting that Captain Darnell is not responsible for the condition of that aircraft? Renata met his eyes. I'm suggesting that Captain Darnell is responsible for doing an impossible job under impossible conditions. And I'm suggesting that if you want to court-martial someone, you start at the top. The colonel's jaw tightened. That's not how this works. Then maybe, Renata said quietly, the system's broken. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Renata stepped down from the stand and walked out of the room without waiting for dismissal. She didn't know if her testimony would save Darnell, didn't know if it would change anything, but she'd said what needed to be said, and that would have to be enough. Outside, the sky was the color of steel. Renata stood in the cold November air and let herself breathe. Carrick found her a few minutes later. That was either very brave or very stupid, he said. Renata smiled faintly. Probably both, he nodded. For what it's worth, I think you're right about all of it. Doesn't matter if I'm right, Renata said. Matters if anyone listens. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the clouds roll in. Then Carrick spoke again. They're reassigning you back to the States, training command. Renata's heart sank. When? 2 weeks. She closed her eyes. Training command, the place where pilots went to fade away. She'd spend the rest of her career teaching kids how to fly, watching them disappear into the same machine that had almost killed her. But she didn't argue, didn't fight, she just nodded. Okay, Carrick hesitated. Revenant, you know your call sign's going to follow you, right? What you did, people are going to remember. Renata looked at him. Good, she said. Someone should. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Renata packed her gear, said goodbye to the crew chiefs, and avoided the flight line like it carried a curse. On her last night at Kandahar, she walked out to the tarmac alone and stood beneath the stars. The A-10s were lined up in neat rows, their angular silhouettes black against the darker sky. She found Warthog 72 at the end of the line, or what was left of it. The fuselage was scarred and patched, the left wing replaced, the engines rebuilt. It looked like Frankenstein's monster. It looked perfect. She placed her hand on the nose just below the painted teeth that made the Warthog look like it was grinning. The metal was cold under her palm. Thanks, she whispered. The aircraft didn't answer. It never did. But Renata stood there for a long time anyway, memorizing the shape of it, the weight of it, the way it smelled like oil and war and survival. Then she turned and walked away. 2 days later, she was on a transport plane headed west, the Afghan desert shrinking behind her until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon. She didn't look back. Looking back was how you got stuck. Nellie's Air Force Base, Nevada. Home of the fighter pilot, the weapons school, the endless blue sky that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single cloud. Renata arrived in December when the desert was cold and the air smelled like creosote and jet fuel. They assigned her to the 57th Wing, teaching close air support to freshly minted pilots who didn't know what it meant to fly low enough to see the faces of the people you were trying to save. She hated it. Not the teaching, she was good at that, patient and precise and unforgiving in the way that kept people alive, but the distance. The way the missions felt theoretical, sanitized, like playing a video game where nobody actually died. The students called her Captain Voss in the classroom and Revenant when they thought she couldn't hear. The nickname had followed her across the ocean, carried by rumors and retold stories. Some of them were true, most weren't. She didn't correct them, let them believe what they wanted. And change the work. 3 months into her tour, a new class arrived. 12 pilots, all of them sharp and hungry and terrifyingly young. Renata stood in front of them on the first day and studied their faces. Close air support, she began, is not about being a hero, it's about being precise. It's about understanding that the people on the ground are counting on you not to kill them. And it's about accepting that you will make mistakes and those mistakes will haunt you. She paused. Any questions? A hand went up in the back row. A lieutenant with red hair and freckles who looked like she should still be in high school. "Ma'am, is it true you landed an A-10 without engines?" The room went silent. Renata met the lieutenant's eyes. "Yes." "How?" Renata considered the question. Considered lying, deflecting, changing the subject. Then she said, "I didn't have a choice." The lieutenant frowned. "But the manual says." "The manual," Renata interrupted, "is written by people who have never had both engines fail at the same time. The manual is a starting point, it's not gospel." She stepped closer. "You want to know how I did it? I stayed calm, I trusted my training, and I got lucky. In that order, but mostly I didn't give up because giving up wasn't an option." She looked around the room. "That's the only lesson that matters, not the technical specs, not the procedures. Just this: when everything goes wrong, you keep flying. You keep fighting, you keep breathing, and you do not quit." The room stayed silent. Renata turned back to the board and picked up a marker. "Now, let's talk about altitude management." The weeks turned into months. Renata taught her classes, ran her simulations, and spent her evenings alone in base housing, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was what the rest of her life would look like. Then one day in late March, Colonel Hale walked into her office unannounced. He looked older than she remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. "Captain Voss," he said. "Colonel." She stood, expecting. She didn't know what. Another investigation, another reprimand. Instead, he held out a folder. "This is for you." She took it, opened it, and froze. Inside was a set of orders, a transfer back to Kandahar, back to the 104th Fighter Squadron, back to the cockpit. "Sir, I don't understand." Hale's expression was unreadable. "Darnell was acquitted. Your testimony made the difference. The board concluded that the failures were systemic, not individual. There's going to be a review of maintenance protocols across the entire Air Force." He paused. "You embarrassed some very powerful people, Captain, but you were right." Renata stared at the orders. "Why are you sending me back?" "Because you're a pilot," Hale said, "not a teacher, and because we need people like you in the fight." He met her eyes. "You've earned this, Voss, don't waste it." He turned and walked out, leaving Renata alone with the folder in her hands and a feeling she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or something close to it. She returned to Afghanistan in April when the poppies were blooming and the air was thick with heat and dust. The base looked the same, smelled the same, but something had shifted. The pilots who'd ignored her before nodded when she walked past. The crew chiefs grinned.